Hello and welcome to the fifth and final video in this series covering Chapter 9 of Government in America. We're going to work on wrapping up some thoughts on voting behavior and then how we interpret the voting results. The first thing to keep in mind is that the voting population of the United States is not exactly the same as the overall population of the United States. Our voter turnout in the U.S. Varies depending on what type of election you're talking about. Presidential elections tend to have the highest turnout. Over the past few elections, I think it's somewhere in the 55 to 65% range. In 2012, it was about 58% of registered voters or eligible voters turned out to vote. In non-presidential elections, that number goes down. For example, in 2015 in Philadelphia, we had a mayoral election. 25% of eligible voters showed up to vote in that election. So when you talk about the voting population, the electorate, that's a sample of the overall population. It's not the whole population. And that voting group is not exactly proportional to the population of the United States. There are certain types of people who are more likely to vote or vote in greater numbers than other groups. And these are pretty consistent patterns that have been noted over time, and candidates take note of them, campaigns take note of them, and affect the way they make decisions. Education is a very large factor. The more formal education someone has had, from high school to having some college work, completing an associate's degree, completing a bachelor's degree, going on and doing graduate or professional degrees. The further along that process you are, the more likely you are to vote. The older that you are, the more likely you are to vote. Younger people have not turned out to vote, which tends to mean that elected officials put a little less priority on issues that affect younger people versus issues that affect older people. Because if the younger people are unhappy, they'll complain about it and then they won't vote to do anything about it. Whereas if an elected official does something to upset an older voter, then not only will that older voter complain about it, but that older voter will show up and probably vote against you. So age is a factor that tends to correspond with voting. Race and ethnicity tends to be a factor. The minority groups in America tend to vote at a lower rate than Americans who identify as white. So there are a lot of factors that go into that, and the socioeconomic factors that explain that are probably outside the purview of a 15-minute YouTube video, but it is a trend and it is something that has been noted. It has changed a little bit, recently, but we'll see how permanent those trends are. In terms of gender, it does appear that women vote at a higher rate than men do, and marital status is also a factor. People who are married are more likely to vote than people who are not married. Why that is, it probably links to marriage being associated with maybe being a little bit more rooted in a community. If you've quote unquote settled down to get married, you may also have settled down to live in a certain place and gotten familiar with it and then feel more motivated to vote. That's one possible reason why married Americans tend to vote at a higher rate than unmarried Americans. So we know about these factors, and candidates try and take them into account if they, they tailor their message to the people that they know go to vote, and if they know that they're popular among a group that doesn't historically vote, they put extra effort into getting that group out to the polls. But the next question is, what is it that motivates us to vote for a candidate, and what can we learn? What can we conclude from the results of an election? Lots of people like to believe that voters vote for the candidate who suggests policies that the voters like the best. Therefore, the candidate who wins is getting an order from the voters to, yes, go ahead and enact those policies. And this idea that winning an election gives you a mandate or requirement to do the things that you want to do is referred to as the mandate theory of elections. And candidates who win love the mandate theory of elections. They like to come into office and say, I was voted in by the people, and so we should do this thing that I talked about doing. But the fact of the matter is, reality is more complicated than the mandate theory of elections. It doesn't really hold through. Because not every person who votes because they've looked over the entire party platform and said, yes, I agree with all of these policies and I want you to go do them. Some people will vote based on party ID. And people don't always associate with a party because of a specific policy. It might be because of their family. It might be because of tradition. It could be because of habit. It could just because of an emotional connection. I've always been a Democrat, so I'm in with the Democrats. I've always been a Republican, so I'm in with the Republicans. Voters sometimes go by the personal qualities. Do they like or do they trust a particular candidate? They may not know, they may not care what the candidate stands for. They just say, I like that person, I'll vote for that person. At which point, when the person they liked and trusted wins and says, oh, now I want to enact this policy that I talked about, they might say, oh, no, I don't want you to do that. And so it becomes, there becomes a disconnect between winning the election and getting to enact your policies. And then even for the voters who want to vote based on policy, remember the idea that you're trying to appeal to as many voters as possible. Well, in order to appeal to as many voters as possible, as a candidate, you might deliberately be vague and not say, here's exactly what I want to do. And so that becomes an issue that makes it hard to say, oh, this person won, so they should enact all of their policies. And finally, there are voters who they don't pay attention to the specific policies or the party. They basically vote based on how they feel things are going right now. If they're happy with how things are going, they'll vote for the same party that is in power. If they think things aren't going well, they'll vote for the opposite party. Just because they figure, well, either keep doing what you're doing or change something, but they're not being specific about what that is. And so the voters can send a very muddled message. And in the American system, that can get compounded because we can vote for lots of different offices. Here in Pennsylvania in 2014, voters across the state voted for the Democratic candidate for governor. And, that candidate had made a bunch of things, had said a bunch of things during the campaign about what he wanted to do. And so when he got elected and took office in the beginning of 2015, he figured, okay, now I'm going to start putting these things into place. Well, the problem was many of the same voters who voted for this Democratic candidate for governor also voted for Republican candidates for the state legislature. They split their tickets. And as a result, the Republicans who won the state legislature races came into office and said, well, we have a mandate from our voters to not do any of the things that the Democratic governor wants to do. And as a result, the Democratic governor and the Republican legislature have been arguing about a lot of policies for the last year, both of them claiming to have mandates from the voters, and neither one of them really being able to get their way. So that's one of the things that goes into interpreting election results. You can't always assume that just because the American people voted for somebody that they support all of the policies that that candidate supports. So we'll wrap up with the campaigns and voting discussion here, and start moving on into once people are elected, how does the system work? We'll be getting into that into later chapters. But for now, I will leave you with these questions for further thought and discussion.